Happy Sunday. Welcome back. This is Faith Lutheran Middle School for Unit 5 again. So happy to have you back. Again, I'm still Mark McCall, your timekeeper and facilitator for the day. If it's okay with you, we'll stick with what we were doing yesterday with the green background for your 1-minute warning and then the yellow background for the end of time at the end of 4 minutes and 8 minutes. And after that, and as of that, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and hand you back to the judges and enjoy what you have to say.
And good morning. Let me just be sure I've got this right, because if I remember, this is the team where there are 3 of you at the table and there's the swivel camera. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Okay. It's good to see you again. My name is Lindsay Draper. I am currently Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Institute for Wellbeing in Law. My co-judges are.
You're muted.
I'm Candida Steele, and I'm still retired from being judge on the U.S. Civilian Board of Contract Appeals. Good to see you.
Welcome back this afternoon. My name's Rebecca Tinder, retired attorney from Charleston, West Virginia, and the West Virginia We the People coordinator. So glad to be here with you.
And could I impose on you to remind us who you are?
Hi, I am Emily Tan.
I am Dagny Bischoff.
I'm Nicholas Fitzgerald.
And we go to Faith Lutheran Middle School and High School. We're here with our coach, Miss Carroll. Thank you for taking your time off today to listen to us present Unit 5.
Thanks. So the question that we're going to be doing is the second one from the unit. Political and social movements in American history have been successful because of the right of assembly. President Abraham Lincoln wrote in a letter that the right of peaceable assembly is part of the constitutional substitute for revolution. Do you agree or disagree with President Lincoln? Why? What is the history of freedom of assembly in America? What historical or contemporary evidence is there, if any, that political and social movements have led to significant changes in laws or policies? What limits, if any, should be placed on the right to freedom of assembly? Begin.
The Congress shall make no law abridging the right of the people to peaceably assemble, states the Freedom of Assembly Clause. Freedom of assembly and the privilege to protest is an essential right that has inspired many political and social movements within the past and the present, such as abolitionism, women's suffrage in the 19th and 20th centuries, the labor movement within the progressive era after the New Deal, and the civil rights movement. Freedom of assembly, primarily recognized by Pennsylvania when they established their Declaration of Rights in 1776, was an important addition to the First Amendment rights. It guaranteed U.S. citizens the opportunity to express their opinions and their views to their own society, as well as promoted public discourse and diversity. For instance, in the Cox versus Louisiana court case of 1965, Elton Cox was charged with 4 offenses after organizing a large group of Black citizens to protest the incarceration of other Blacks outside of the Supreme Court of Louisiana. When taken to the U.S. Supreme Court, the court revoked the state's law that gave the authorities the ability to arrest the civil rights marchers, declaring that the law infringed upon freedoms of assembly as well as speech. The Supreme Court recognizes the need for freedom of assembly, and it respects the right to peacefully protest. Author and political activist Elie Wiesel once said, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest."
Additionally, we respect the need for freedom of assembly, as it had a positive impact on our country. We believe that the right of peaceable assembly is the constitutional substitute for revolution. According to Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham City Jail, he states the 4 steps to achieve peaceable assembly: gathering facts, negotiating, self-purification, and engaging in action. Without committing lawless acts, people practicing the right of peaceable assembly while speaking out their concerns, revolutionary or not, cannot be censored under the government. For an example, in the court case of Edwards versus South Carolina, a group of African Americans peacefully protested against segregation and were fined. The courts later ruled that they were merely exercising the right to assembly. Additionally, there are other examples throughout history that prove the importance of assembly. For an example, the civil rights movement led to the creation of the 24th Amendment, enabling those who fail to pay any tax to vote, the Voting Rights Act, encouraging the lack of prejudice referring to skin when voting, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 which completely abolished segregation in public places. Additionally, due to the Black Lives Matter movement, states enforced new policies regarding their police force, such as officer-worn cameras, training racial bias, investigations when police use force, and new limits on military equipment. The freedom of assembly has obviously benefited our country for our common good.
We clearly see many times where our freedom of assembly has led to change in this country. For this reason, we believe that there should be no official limits against the freedom of assembly other than the ones already given in the Constitution. For example, the forcible betrayal of the country, as stated in Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, isn't protected under our First Amendment right to assembly. Therefore, we believe that the Constitution sets clear regulations for what is right and wrong during assembly. The laws of the Constitution and the bills that our government have passed were used in the court case of Gregory v. City of Chicago, when civil protesters had done nothing wrong and were completely at peace, but the police tried to stop them based on nothing. The Supreme Court ruled that the peaceful protest was in fact legal and constitutional. This dilemma shows that the Constitution gives us the right to our freedoms as well as having regulations. Similarly, during the American Revolution, the British tried to take away the colonists' freedom of assembly and expression. But ultimately, their rebellion against the British government and events such as the Boston Massacre secured their freedom. Therefore, we believe that our founding fathers did a great job securing our freedom of assembly for the benefit of the common good, as well as keeping it fair by adding rules and regulations to how we can use our freedoms and create change. We are now ready for questions.
Great.
You gave a litany, well, you gave several examples at the beginning of your presentation where assembly, and in this case, protests have been significant. Could you give me, if I got the list correct, I think the most recent one was the civil rights era, which is, roughly half a century ago. Anything else come to mind? Examples, any more recent ones than the Black Lives Matter movement and police reform? Anything else come to mind?
The environmental justice movement has been a recent movement regarding environmental justice for minority communities. Recently, minority communities have been influenced and affected by pollution. So the environmental justice movement is there to help them secure their environment and protect it.
To add on to my colleague, although there hasn't been as much on the news about this, there have been a lot of protests recently in the last few months about COVID-19 restrictions. Especially lately, there have been a lot because people are starting to get the vaccine, so they don't want masks anymore and they don't want to have to be socially distanced. So although it hasn't been over the news because they have been very peaceful protests, there have also been protests about COVID-19.
In addition to my colleague's response, I'd also like to mention the Capitol storming on January 6th, where people or angry American citizens stormed the Capitol building and vandalized and occupied and looted the building for several hours, as well as harmed other people and destroyed property.
You think that was peaceful assembly? Sorry.
No, you asked what I was going to say. Would you include that in a discussion of peaceable assembly?
I would not include it in the discussion of peaceable assembly. I'd rather discuss about it in a discussion about violent assembly because that wasn't particularly a peaceful protest.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, then why don't you go on and tell us of some other examples of violent assemblies and why there's a distinction?
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
I don't mean
Another example of a
Go ahead, sorry.
Another example of a violent protest is not actually very recent, but it is the Boston Tea Party. Angry American citizens snuck on board onto merchant ships and dumped over 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor.
Any other thoughts? Does anybody have any, do you think actually that any of the violent protests resulted in positive change, even if they were violent protests?
Well, although the Boston Tea Party wasn't very constitutional and the right to property was destroyed, when they dumped over $1,700 million of tea into Boston Harbor. I believe it helped shape a lot just because it was a huge movement and it was the start to the Revolutionary War.
I'll have to disagree with my colleague. I think peaceable assemblies are more beneficial and more effective rather violent assemblies. For an example, the women's suffrage progression consisted of many peaceable assemblies and resulted in the 19th Amendment. Violent assemblies usually occur due to the rage of citizens rather trying to speak out their opinions.
To add on to my colleagues, although 93% of the Black Lives Matter protests were peaceful, the 7% of riots or unpeaceful protests have clearly taken over our country and taken over the news. So I would agree with Emily here that peaceful protests are much more beneficial to get your word across. And with the Black Lives Matter riots taking over the news and taking over everyone's mind, it hasn't led to as much change as they would like. And if they had even like 99 to 100% of those protests be peaceful, I think there would have been a lot more change even by now, although it's only been a few months.
In DeYoung versus Oregon, the Supreme Court held that freedom of assembly was as important as freedom of speech. Do you agree or disagree, and why?
I completely agree because speech and assembly are just as much are both like a part of freedom of expression, which is another important thing in our country.
I would also have to agree that freedom of assembly and freedom of speech kind of go hand in hand. So during that case, when Mr. DeYoung was speaking his voice about communism, he didn't incite violence or use violence. So I believe that during the a peaceful protest and during the assembly, he used his freedom of speech to get his message across, as well as his freedom of assembly. So I think if you use both peacefully and that they both really go hand in hand. So I think that if you use both peacefully, you will get your message across.
I'll have to agree with my colleague.
Why do we need assembly if all of us can get our message across? Isn't speech paramount?
I think assembly is very important because it shows that you're not the only one who believes this, and it shows that you have a group of people with you who are on your side and that are willing to create change with you. If you're just speaking your voice, there's a lower chance that people will agree with you. But if you have a bunch of people around you and you are really out there in public and you're letting your opinions known, I think it's much more effective.
I agree with my colleague Nick because usually people are convinced through majority opinion. If one states an opinion that they believe, but no one else believes it, then their voice wouldn't be much as heard as, say, a group of people that states the same opinion.
One of the more interesting aspects to me in American history occurred back in after World War I, when a lot of Americans got concerned about the East and Central Europeans coming into this country. And then in 1924 and 25, the Ku Klux Klan staged huge marches on Washington. 20 to 30,000 people showed up both years. How do we address scary ideas when they present themselves in peaceful assembly?
I believe whether it is racial discrimination or say, even if it's peaceful assemblies, I believe they still should have their voice, even if others disagree with their opinions.
I would have to agree with my colleague, and I think it kind of goes back to the DeYoung versus Oregon case. Although communism is a very controversial topic, and most people would disagree with them, I believe that they did have the right to peacefully protest, and as long as it is peaceful, there's no property destroyed, there's no human life destroyed. I believe that all people have the right to assembly, and it's written under our Constitution and in the Bill of Rights.
Additionally, in the court case Carroll versus the President and Commissioners of Princess Anne, a group of white supremacists had rallied outside of a courthouse. the commissioners had filed a restraining order against them. The courts ruled for the side of the white supremacist group because, like I stated before, any type of peaceable assembly should be constitutional and cannot be censored under the government. I don't think there should be many regulations necessary for
It's yellow. Great.
Lindsay?
I'm sorry, I was trying to think about how to discuss the rudeness in cutting you off. In that it was important to give you the chance once you cited the case, but we needed to stop you because you were going on a little bit. But I think the fact that you had a case that was important was an example of how this was a very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. And by the way, I don't know where you came up with the 7% of the Black Lives Matter protests got ragged, 93% went well, but people remember the 7% and therefore the message wasn't heard. I don't know where the numbers came from, but I think that's been one of the points that I have been troubled by much of the last few months, is that you had a bunch of people who walked in the country, had a really important message, vast, overwhelming majority did it the right way, but that's not who we talk about. And if you listen to people of a certain political bent, that 7% is all that was out there. So I really appreciated you pointing out not only that fact occurred, but also that, frankly, some folks can sway opinion by infiltrating what might have been a peaceful protest and pretending to be a part of it. So I really appreciated that you had that recognition. There's a lot that you talked about that I should be quiet. I enjoyed you. Thank you.
So did I. I thought that was a very nice presentation. Particular things that I thought were particularly interesting was your discussion of the MLK's letter from Birmingham jail. The starting out just with the Pennsylvania Declaration of Rights was good. If I'd had more time and we'd have gotten to, I would have asked more about your investing, the changes in police military equipment, for example, that you raised, that there would be limits on military equipment. There was an interesting case yesterday that apparently Pittsburgh has said that has a new statute that the police cannot use tear gas or rubber bullets or anything against any protesters. So there's been some change, and you noted that. You aimed that direction. The COVID-19 restrictions was very interesting, but going back to the Boston Tea Party was also excellent. And I didn't mean to interrupt you with your white supremacy case at the end, but that was excellent as well. Thank you. You did a really wonderful job. And as I said yesterday, I'm really happy that you all know as much as you do about the Constitution. It'll make me feel a whole lot better in my old age. And thank you. You did a great job. I hope you had fun doing this.
Thank you again. I echo the comments of my colleagues. Enjoyed your prepared remarks, a wealth of information contained in the prepared remarks, as was indicated, including a number of cases, Cox and Edwards and the city of Chicago. You covered a lot of ground there. And then you were able to show us that you not only had those cases, but you understood the concepts when we were asking, and you understood them more broadly than just the examples that you brought up, when you were able to also talk about the environmental movement and the COVID restrictions as well. You brought back up DeYoung when you were answering a question, which was appropriate for answering that question. I thought it was interesting that you related that assembly is important because the majority opinion. People are convinced by the majority opinion. So people are watching to see what is the majority opinion when they see the assembly taking place. Is that the majority opinion? I thought that was an interesting concept, and I appreciated our conversation and wish it could have gone on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, team. Really appreciate your hard work today. And Ms. Carroll, thank you for your hard work in leading them forward. Good luck and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.